Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at the continuity of consciousness. With me is Stephen Schwartz, who is one of the founders of the Society for the Anthropological Study of Consciousness, which is part of the American Anthropological Association. He is also the author of The Secret Vaults of Time and the Alexandria Project, An Opening to the Infinite, and The 8 Laws of Change. Stephen is an experienced parapsychology researcher. Welcome, Stephen.
Good to see you.
Pleasure to be with you. As an anthropologist, I guess it's unescapable that humans, going back to the earliest graves, seem to have shown a respect for the dead and a belief in the afterlife.
Yes, I think that's true. There are only the modern cultures, and really the modern Western cultures, have had the idea that we were animated meat.
Mm-hmm.
Dead meat, no consciousness.
Yeah.
The idea that there was continuity of consciousness has been widely held by pre-technological cultures, and is again asserting itself based on the research that we're seeing in a wide range of disciplines in science today, and has profound implications.
Well, and when we talk about the continuity of consciousness, we're really talking about consciousness both before birth and after death.
That's right. I would start the discussion with this. In 1931, Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics, and at that point, well, arguably one of the 2 or 3 most famous scientists in the world, Einstein, was asked in an interview by The Observer, then one of the leading still one of the leading newspapers in the English language. And Planck took the interview. He didn't give hundreds of interviews. He took the interview very specifically understanding that he was going to make statements that would be read. And so this is not a casual conversation. And they asked him, you're the father of quantum mechanics and you're one of the leading scientists in the world, and what have you learned? And his answer was, I've learned that consciousness is fundamental and causal. Materiality arises from consciousness, not consciousness from materiality. You cannot get behind consciousness. It is the fundamental.
Well, was he referring to individual consciousness or something larger?
I think he is referring to both.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't ask the question, so of course we can't know absolutely.
Yeah.
But the point I think he was trying to make was that we need to rethink what our view of reality is. Because if you start with the idea that consciousness is causal, and that materiality, space-time, is a manifestation of consciousness, well, that places you in a rather different position. And when you when you think from that perspective, then the idea of the continuity of consciousness, what you're really talking about is that consciousness is present prior to physical incarnation, prior to your being born, and it exists after corporeal death. And that this eternal part of our consciousness, what religion would call the soul, I think, episodically, for reasons we don't understand very clearly, chooses to manifest a new personality and incarnate it. The research that's being done, for instance, in reincarnation by people like Ian Stevenson, Erlander Haraldsson, now Jim Tucker, is quite comprehensive, although not very well known. I mean, if you look at this research that's been done, they're talking about bringing it back. Not that you're coming back, Jeff and Stephen are not coming back, but that eternal aspect of ourselves will manifest at some other time, another personality, but that personality will be informed by information structures that preceded its manifestation. And this comes
personality tendencies.
Well, not just personality tendencies. Stevenson, before he died, wrote an extraordinarily important book called Biology and Reincarnation, in which he was studying birthmarks and scar tissue, wound tissue, that people would bring across from one lifetime to another.
In other words, like the death wound in one life would be the birthmark in the next.
Yes. Well, for instance, an example is a young boy is born in a village in India, and the reason they do a lot of this research in the Asian countries is that reincarnation is a culturally accepted idea, and so people talk about it in a way that they don't in the West, although there is a lot of Western work going on now. But in any case, this story, this child says that he was a moneylender in another village long distance away that nobody in his village even knows exists, and that he was having an affair with a woodcutter. And one day the woodcutter came home unexpectedly, and he was dallying with the man's wife, and when they heard him coming, he tried to climb out the window, but the woodcutter ran into the room and took his axe and killed him with it. And this child is born with wound tissue, scar tissue, keloid, exactly where this wound supposedly occurred. Well, how do you check that kind of thing? Well, what they do is you accumulate all this information, and then they went to the village described, and it turns out there was such a village, and they go to the place where the event has supposedly occurred, and yes, there's a woman living there, and well, yes, she did have an affair with a moneylender, and yes, her husband did kill him, and so this all gets followed up, and turns out to be true, or
largely true.
Yes, I mean, well,
not so different from your archaeological projects in terms of the percentage of statements that are accurate.
Yes, actually, I never thought of it that way. Yeah, that's true. That's true. The reason I particularly like the biological material is that it doesn't have subjective interpretation built into it. That is, when you remember something, you don't necessarily remember it 100% accurately. Was the door on the left or the door on the right? You get confused, or your memory gets dim. But a biological marker, like a birthmark or a wound tissue, doesn't require subjective interpretation. And in any case, the point I'm trying to make is that when to really understand this idea of continuity of consciousness, I think you have to look not at just one little body of research, but at a number of areas of research. You have to look at near-death studies. It's estimated now that about 4.2% of the American public has had a near-death experience that they have reported. This is the important part.
4.2%?
Yes, that's about 13 million people.
The 4.2%, that means that they've come to the edge of death and been resuscitated.
That is correct. And the number is actually considerably larger because we know from the research that many people have near-death experiences that they never talk about except to family and friends. So we're just talking about near-death experiences where you had this experience while you were on an operating room table, physicians were in attendance, so they come to know about it, or that immediately after resuscitating you, you talk to them, that kind of thing. So the actual number is larger, but in any case, we're talking about millions of people, which means we're also talking about thousands of physicians who attend these millions of people, maybe tens of thousands of physicians. So you look at the near-death work.
Right.
You look at the fact that resuscitation medicine, which didn't really exist until about 10 years ago, now has an understanding of the physiology of death that simply didn't exist just a few years ago. You look at a researcher like Sam Parnia, for instance, who's talking about the nuances. I mean, the argument about against near death is it's some kind of ketamine-like experience of the dying brain, or well, when you actually climb into the medicine seriously, you find out that those are all antiquated ideas. And what Parnia is talking about is that death is much more nuanced than we realize. But we can talk about when cognitive ability ceases. So you have that corpus of work. And all of the people that are doing that, there's now a journal called Resuscitation where they talk about all this. So this is a whole area of research that simply didn't exist. Then you look at communications research. That is, can you communicate with a discorporeal personality?
In other words, all the work on mediumship.
Mediumship and in all of the nuances that involves. And then you look at the reincarnation research. And these are really almost separate communities of researchers. They publish in their own areas and really work amongst themselves. But when you look at that, for instance, Ed Kelly, who's at the University of Virginia, researcher, a very good researcher.
Yes. Author of, or editor of the great anthology, Irreducible Mind.
Yes, and a newer one called Beyond Physicalism. He works with Jim Tucker, who has taken on the reincarnation work of Ian Stevenson. I mean, and they're down to a level of nuance where, for instance, they report that if you die unexpectedly in a violent termination, an automobile accident, for instance, or a murder, that kind of thing, that the average time between incarnations is 16 months. Not 2 years, not 10 years, 16 months, which I think is very interesting. Not 15, not 14.
Well, it's an average, and it's based on, I know they have thousands of cases now in their database.
Exactly. That's the point I was going to make, is that we're not talking about 3 or 4 or 5 people. We're talking about they have thousands of cases in many different cultures, not just Asian cultures.
European,
Erlander Harrelson was working with the Druze in the Middle East. There's work that's being done in the United States. There's work that's being done in a number of Asian countries. Asian researchers have gotten interested in this. So there's a whole corpus of material. Then you look at the communications research, the mediumship, all that sort of thing. That's a whole other body of work that's been going on.
I've always been fascinated by the cross-correspondence cases where you have a supposed spirit who communicates through multiple mediums, and the messages only make sense when you put them together.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so this is highly nuanced research. And there is quite a lot of it over many decades. And
about 140 years.
Yeah, and so what it's really suggesting to us is that we need to not only rethink what we mean by being a human, but also what reality is. And now that's the reason I started with Planck, is that what Planck is trying to say to us is that consciousness is the fundamental. And if you begin to think in those terms, then you realize that if space-time itself is a creation of consciousness, on my computer screens, I've got Hubble Deep Space Telescope images, and they look like stars, but they are, in fact, galaxies. And you realize we're talking about trillions of planets, potentially, that all of this is a construction of consciousness, that and that there is a unity of consciousness. We live in a matrix of consciousness. We know from, for instance, the therapeutic intention research that it is possible for the intention of one organism to have a very significant, measurable, objectively measurable effect on the well-being, good or ill, of another organism. And you begin to realize that we are in a matrix of life.
A matrix that extends beyond the biological.
Yes, and that may extend to some great unity of which we only have the dimmest appreciation. That we are not isolated within our bodies, that we are in fact a part of some much greater plan. I am reminded when I read these papers often of people who become addicted to video games and who really live their life through their avatars.
Yeah.
I was in Japan and they took me, I wanted to see one, and the people that were with me, the Japanese businessmen, took me to what they called a coffin hotel, at least I think that's the right translation, which is basically, a hotel is hardly the right word. It's a kind of 8-foot long cylinder stacked up with a television and with a common bathroom. And young men particularly live in these things, and they spend most of their time in virtual reality, living through their avatar, which they in a world that they create collectively through their conscious intention in the video reality. And I am always, when I think about this business of continuity of consciousness, I wonder, are we all the young men in the coffin hotels living in virtual reality that we think of as reality, but that in fact is a construct of consciousness? And that begins to make you think, what we're really looking at is an information matrix. You know the movie, the Matrix?
Yes.
That's the analogy. I mean, it's not entire, but just as a metaphor.
Yeah.
When you look at the screen in the Matrix and the numbers and symbols are coming down the screen, and then it morphs into reality, and you're there, taste, touch, smell.
Well, I think the filmmakers intended you to think of those,
I'm sure
along those lines. They were very philosophical.
I'm sure that's true. And I was talking with a researcher at MIT who posed a very interesting question to me. I went to see their virtual reality laboratory, and he said, we're on the verge of being able to create the full sensorium. That is, the locus of your consciousness would be in the virtual reality, but you would be able to taste, touch, smell, just as you would in your normal physical consciousness. And so he said, if your locus of consciousness is with your avatar and it's a full sensorium, where are you?
Well, I often wonder if birth and death is like after we die, we might wake up and think, oh, that was an interesting movie.
Yes, exactly. And so it philosophically, metaphysically, I guess one would say, we don't have the science to go there yet, but what these areas of research are telling us, I suggest, is that we need to rethink not only who we are, but our place in this larger matrix. And when you begin to think in that way, it has all kinds of real-world implications, all kinds of implications, because it changes the way you think about the Earth itself. Are you somehow separate from that, and therefore it's exploitable, and you can do what you want with the animals or with the substances of the earth? I mean, it's not, you have...
That's the danger of the video games, I think, is if we begin to see a video game as a metaphor for reality as a whole, then it doesn't much matter what we do.
Yes. And I, again, this MIT guy said to me, I think in the future we're not going to be traveling as much, that people will go into virtual realities to have business meetings or science conferences or something. And so again, he said to me, if you are in a virtual reality and you have full sensorium,
Mm-hmm.
where are you? I think that's a really challenging question.
Yeah. It's a challenging question, and it opens up, I suppose, to other kinds of metaphysical speculation. I recall one researcher suggesting that, well, we don't have reincarnations sequentially. We're actually living them all simultaneously.
I don't know.
Well, because when we talk about outside of time, as we think of it, some theologians or theologians say there's an eternal realm. It's outside of time completely.
Yes.
And from that eternal realm, one can access, as remote viewers do, you certainly know this, any point in time and space.
Yeah, I mean, one of the contributions that parapsychology makes, I think, is that it is showing us it is possible to objectively verify the capacity to move outside of space and time. I mean, we know, for instance, in remote viewing research, that it's as easy to remote viewing something that's in the next room as it is something that's across the planet. Or indeed, Ingo Swann and Harold Sherman did a series of remote viewings of planets before space probes arrived and were able to give accurate information. Now, some people might argue, well, they precognized it and brought it back. And
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the argument. I don't agree with it, but I understand the argument. But the point is that everything that we can see tells us that it is possible for you to have objectively verifiable consciousness experiences which are not limited by space-time. That space and time are informational enrichers. For instance, we know from remote viewing research that it's easier to see Chartres Cathedral than it is a warehouse of the same size.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is that? And the answer, I think, lies in a concept that Jung advanced called numinosity.
Yeah.
Jung says noumena are psychic entia outside of space and time. And I think what he's trying to say is that this is informational architecture that is not limited by space-time.
Mm-hmm.
Chartres Cathedral is easier to see because thousands of people, millions of people, for centuries have been going to Chartres Cathedral, looking at Chartres Cathedral in a state of heightened emotion, and it has become numinous. That it is. What does that mean? It means it has been informationally enriched. Or you look at, for instance, Dean Radin at Institute Noetics
Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Noetic Sciences has been doing a series of experiments which I think are incredibly important, where he has people focus intention on things like tea or chocolate. He splits a bunch of tea or a bunch of chocolate into two piles. One is the control, one's the treated. And he has Buddhist monks focus on the tea or the chocolate. And then he asks people to taste the control tea and the treated tea or the control chocolate, the treated chocolate. And he asks them for their perceptions. And they say, oh, well, this tea makes me feel much more relaxed, or I just feel it, it just seems very nice and it feels more healthful. And now, chemically, nothing has changed in the tea. Nothing has changed in the chocolate. Chemically, physically, in space-time, they're the same. But perceptually, they're different.
Well, we don't know for sure that every chemical test has been run.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's true. I mean, the tea, I did a water experiment showing that healers change the structure of water in a measurable way, and that could be true of the tea.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how it would be true of the chocolate, but okay, it's true.
Be.
They haven't been but as far as we know, there's no physical change. So then the question is, well, where resides the informational alteration that produces the subjective perception? And I would say to you, based on other research, that what you're looking at is that acts of intentioned observation literally alter reality and produce changes in the informational structure that chocolate is the manifestation of, and that when people eat the chocolate, the reason they feel better about it is that the informational and structure of the chocolate has, not the chocolate, the informational structure of the chocolate has been changed by the intentioned awareness of the Buddhist monks.
Well, you're suggesting that there is a realm of information that is attached to but separate from the physical realm.
No, not separate. That the physical realm is the manifestation of the informational realm.
Okay.
And that you can manipulate the informational realm, and that acts of intentioned observation do that, which is why Chartres Cathedral is easier to see than or another one. I started out doing a group of, back in the late 70s, early 80s, I started looking at changes in entropy. Research in which two things which look virtually the same, indistinguishable really, but one of them has a different entropic profile than the other. Not necessarily. Now, I started with physical entropy. I actually started with nuclear carriers and petroleum-powered carriers. And I discovered that when people remote viewed these two carriers, it looked essentially the same.
I've interviewed Ed May on this exact topic.
Yeah, Ed is now, I was just going to say, Ed May has been doing a series of experiments. Ed and I don't agree. I think I'm fair in representing him as a physicalist, but I have great respect for what he does. He's an excellent researcher, so he's been doing experiments where he uses liquid nitrogen and causes an entropic change at the physical level, and reports, as I had reported about these carriers and this carrier experiment, and I did another one about abandoned radio towers and solar towers that look very similar, but people report quite differently. When I looked at the research on the nuclear carriers, people would say things like, by the way, nobody got them as carriers, either in petroleum or nuclear.
You're talking about the remote viewers.
Yeah, they're remote viewers. This is a remote viewing experiment, and I get you to do remote viewings. And in some of them, there's a nuclear carrier, and some of them there is a petroleum-powered carrier. Physically, they look, unless you're a naval specialist, you couldn't tell the difference. But what the people say is there's a little star inside of this thing. It's like a great big metal island with a little star inside of it. Or there's something that's so hot it's like a sun. Or there's something incredibly dangerous and hot, and it has something to do with literally changing nature.
Well, our time is winding down, but what you're suggesting here by going back to the remote viewing work and the concept of entropy is that there is a kind of continuity between the reincarnation research, the life after death research, and the remote viewing research. They're not all distinct. They're part of a spectrum.
Yes, that's the point I want. What this research is telling us collectively, I think, is that we need to reassess our understanding of reality, and that one of the results of that reassessment is that it places upon us a responsibility. Our behavior, our attitudes, our expectations are altered when you realize that consciousness is fundamental and matter is its manifestation.
Stephen Schwartz, thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.